So, um, I imagine waking up tomorrow, pouring your coffee, and you're just, reading this headline in the sports section.
Right, checking the scores.
Yeah, exactly. And the headline says, Chicago Bulls sell star point guard to Los Angeles Lakers.
I mean, you probably wouldn't even blink at that.
Not at all.
Yeah,
Because you intuitively know that the Bulls just, they sold a contract.
right. They transferred labor rights.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They didn't actually sell a human being as a piece of, chattel property.
No, of course not. But what if a historian, say, 3,000 years from now, digs up that digital archive?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And they completely miss our modern legal context, right? And they publish this academic paper accusing the 21st century NBA of running this massive human trafficking ring.
I mean, that would be a catastrophic historical misunderstanding.
Completely. Because they'd be reading their own assumptions into vocabulary that, meant something entirely different in its native environment.
Right. And that massive misunderstanding, that collision between ancient vocabulary and modern assumptions, that's exactly what we are unraveling today.
It's a huge topic.
It is. We are looking at one of the most controversial, emotionally charged, and just highly debated questions out there. Does the Bible condone slavery?
Yeah, it's a question with profound historical weight. I mean, for centuries, people have turned to these ancient texts for liberation.
Right.
But then others have wielded them as weapons of subjugation. And today you have modern critics, think of voices like Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, or academic scholars like Hector Avalos.
People pointing to these texts as proof of inherent cruelty.
Exactly. While at the exact same time, you have the historic interpretive tradition of the church arguing the exact opposite.
So as we dig into this really comprehensive stack of research today, we're going to look at it the way a historian or a legal scholar would.
Right, taking a neutral approach.
Yeah, not just quoting a verse in isolation, but asking the really fundamental questions for you, the listener. Like, what social and economic institutions are actually being regulated here?
And what did this vocabulary even mean in the ancient Near East?
Exactly. And how did these laws compare to the surrounding empires of the time? Like, the Babylonians or the Hittites.
Which brings us right back to your basketball analogy, actually, because we have to start with definitional clarity.
They really do.
Because the English language can be incredibly blunt. Take a word like marriage.
Oh.
If someone tells you, marriage was a primary institution in the 19th century, they haven't actually told you much about the power dynamics of that relationship.
Right, because what kind of marriage are we talking about?
Exactly. Are they talking about monogamy? Are they talking about historical Mormon polygamy?
Or arranged marriages, right.
Right. Arranged marriages in traditional cultures where the participants had, no say at all. Or are they talking about historical practices where brides were literally purchased?
So the word alone just isn't enough. You have to define the specific institution.
You really do.
And the exact same thing applies to the English word slavery. I mean, we use that one word as a catch-all for vastly different systems.
Oh, absolutely. It covers modern underground human trafficking, medieval European serfdom, ancient debt bondage,
Roman household service, and of course the brutally oppressive chattel slavery of the antebellum American South.
Right. So if a critic simply says slavery is in the Bible, they've committed this massive oversimplification.
Because they're just using the umbrella term.
Exactly. Without defining the specific socioeconomic institution or the rights of the individuals involved or the avenues of release, we don't actually know what the text is regulating.
And that oversimplification brings us to the first major hurdle our research highlights. It's what scholars call the translation trap.
The translation trap, yeah. This is crucial.
Because when I open an English translation of the Bible and I read the word slave, my modern Western brain immediately jumps to, 1860s South Carolina.
Right, you picture a cotton plantation, whips, chains.
Human beings treated as literal livestock.
Yeah.
But what is the actual word in the original ancient language?
So in the Old Testament, the primary Hebrew word you encounter is ebed. And in the New Testament, the Greek equivalent is doulos.
Okay, ebed and doulos.
Right. Now, translators often render these as slave or servant. But Old Testament scholar John Goldingay makes a really crucial point here.
What's that?
He says these ancient words absolutely do not map onto the antebellum chattel slavery that modern Westerners picture.
So if I'm an ancient Israelite, what does ebed actually mean to me?
It represents this massive spectrum of social statuses, but it's fundamentally built around a relationship of service or obligation.
Okay, so it could mean a servant.
Yes,
Yeah.
it could refer to a domestic worker or someone working off a debt, but it was also the exact same word used for the highest status royal officials in the land.
Wait, really? The highest officials?
Yeah, think about the book of Second Kings.
Yeah.
There's this powerful Syrian general named Naaman. The text describes him as a great man and a mighty warrior. He commands armies. Yet the text calls him the king's bed.
Wait, so a general commanding an army is called the exact same Hebrew word that gets translated as slave.
Yes, and it goes even further than that. The prophets are consistently referred to as gods of Adim. That's the plural form.
Oh, wow.
Moses is called the Ebed of the Lord. King David, the literal monarch of the nation, is called the Ebed of God.
That's fascinating.
And in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul introduces himself in his letters proudly as a doulos of Christ Jesus.
That completely shatters our modern paradigm. I mean, there's no world in which an antebellum plantation owner would call himself the slave of anyone, let alone wear it as a badge of honor.
Exactly. Because in the ancient Israelite context, there was nothing inherently degrading about being an Ebed.
It just meant you owed service to someone above you.
Right. It denoted a relationship of service, loyalty, and obligation to a superior. It did not mean you lacked personhood or dignity.
And it certainly didn't mean you were a piece of property.
No, not at all. So when critics pull a verse that happens to use the word slave in an English translation and then use that verse to claim the Bible endorses the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade.
They're committing a fundamental category error.
Exactly. They are projecting a 19th century chattel institution onto ancient Near Eastern vocabulary that was describing something entirely different.
Okay, I track with the vocabulary argument on Ebed, but I have to push back here because it's not just the noun that bothers people, right? It's the verbs.
Okay.
When you read the ancient laws, the text literally uses words like buy, sell, and acquire.
Right.
I mean, if I buy a car, it's my property. If I sell a house, I'm transferring ownership of a thing. Doesn't the use of those verbs explicitly prove that these ancient people were being treated as property?
If we were speaking 21st century English, yes, that assumption makes perfect sense.
Right.
But we have to look at the Hebrew verbs the way an ancient reader would. The primary verb often translated as buy or acquire is kana.
Kana, okay.
And just like the noun ebed, the verb kana has a very wide semantic domain. It does not inherently mean purchasing chattel.
So walk me through how else it's used.
Well, in Genesis, the exact same verb is used to describe God as the possessor or acquirer of heaven and earth.
Obviously, God didn't purchase the universe at a market.
Exactly. When Eve gives birth to Cain, she says she has acquired a man with the help of the Lord. In the book of Ruth, Boaz legally acquires Ruth as a wife.
So Boaz didn't buy Ruth like you'd buy, a farm animal.
Exactly. He entered into a legally recognized covenantal relationship with her. He didn't own her as chattel.
Ah, gosh.
And this is where your NBA analogy from earlier perfectly crystallizes what's happening. When a team buys or sells an athlete, what is actually changing hands?
The labor contract. The exclusive right to that person's time and skill for a set period.
Precisely. It is a highly regulated transfer of contractual labor obligations. The athlete retains full personhood, legal rights, and dignity outside of that specific labor agreement.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, so when the Old Testament refers to buying or selling a servant, the formal legal action taking place is a contractual transaction transferring labor obligations.
It's not the transfer of a human being into a category of property.
Right. It's a labor contract.
All right, if we're dealing with contractual labor agreements rather than chattel slavery, that completely changes the lens through which we view these ancient texts.
It really does.
But, a contract is only as good as its terms. If we want to understand how humane or oppressive this system was, we have to understand how someone ended up in one of these contracts.
Right. The entry points.
Yeah, like why would you sign away your labor in the first place?
To understand that, we have to mentally strip away all the safety nets of modern society. We have to step into the brutal socioeconomic reality of the ancient Near East.
Which was incredibly harsh.
Oh, unimaginably harsh. We are talking about a subsistence agricultural economy in the 13th century BC. There are no modern banking systems to give you a loan if your business fails.
No government welfare programs, no food stamps.
No Chapter 11 bankruptcy courts, and definitely no corporate wage labor market you can just, drop your resume into.
Your survival is entirely tied to the rain and the dirt.
Literally. If a multi-year drought hits or a plague of locusts destroys your harvest, your family starves. Death was a constant looming threat.
Wow.
So, the ancient Israelite system, specifically laid out in Leviticus 25, created a graduated social safety net to prevent starvation.
How did that work practically? Like, let's say my crops fail. What's the step one?
Step one relies on the extended family. A wealthier relative, a kinsman redeemer, is supposed to step in, buy your debt, and keep you afloat.
Okay. But let's say the famine is widespread and my relatives are broke too.
Step two is you mortgage your ancestral land. You lease out its production to a wealthier neighbor in exchange for food.
But if the drought continues, eventually I have no crops, no family help, and no land. I have nothing left to leverage.
And this is where indentured servitude becomes the final starvation prevention measure.
The last resort.
Exactly. You voluntarily enter into a household service contract with someone who has resources. You essentially say, I will provide my labor to your household, and in exchange, you will pay off my debt and provide room, board, and protection for me and my family.
It's an act of utter desperation, but it's an alternative to literally dying in the dirt.
Yes.
And our sources point to a really fascinating parallel here that brings this much closer to home. We tend to look back at the ancient world and think this is barbaric.
Right.
But historian David Gallinson points out that in early colonial America, before the widespread explosion of the African slave trade, 1/2 to 2/3 of all white immigrants arriving in Britain's North American colonies came as indentured servants.
That is a massive percentage of the population.
Think about it. They were desperate for a new life, but they couldn't afford the transatlantic passage. So they voluntarily signed a contract, binding their labor to a colonial farmer or tradesman for a set number of years.
Usually 4 to 7 years, right?
Yeah, to pay off the debt of the journey.
Yeah.
They were legally bound to their employer. They could be punished for running away.
But no historian today looks at early American indentured servitude and calls it slavery in the moral chattel sense.
Exactly. We recognize it as a harsh but temporary labor contract.
And that word temporary is the absolute crux of the matter.
Why is that?
Because what distinguishes a harsh labor contract from institutional slavery is the exit strategy. The defining characteristic of antebellum chattel slavery was permanent, inheritable bondage.
You were born a slave, you died a slave.
And your children were born slaves. The biblical legal framework made that kind of permanent, inheritable underclass structurally impossible.
So let's talk about how you get out. If I've sold my labor to survive a famine, how do I get my life back?
The first major release mechanism is the 7-year release, detailed in Deuteronomy 15.
Okay.
The law mandated that at the end of 6 years of service, the indentured servant was legally required to be released in the 7th year. It was a universal cancellation of the labor debt.
Now wait. I know critics who are well-versed in ancient history will point to Hammurabi's Code.
Ah, yes, Hammurabi.
Because Hammurabi was the Babylonian king who predates Moses, and his code mandated release for debt slaves after only 3 years. I've heard critics argue that the biblical law is actually less humane because it forces them to work twice as long.
It's a very common talking point, but it falls apart entirely when you actually look at the mechanics of the two legal codes.
How so?
First, Hammurabi's 3-year release was highly conditional. It mostly applied to a man's wife or children who were giving to work off his debt. It didn't universally apply to everyone.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, but more importantly, you have to ask what happens on the day of release.
Right. If I've been working for 3 years just for room and board, I don't have a savings account.
Exactly. Under Hammurabi's code, a released debt worker was pushed out the door completely destitute. They had no land, no seed, no flocks. What do you think happens to a destitute person in a subsistence economy?
They immediately starve, or they just sign another debt contract. It's a revolving door of poverty.
Precisely. Hammurabi's code mathematically guaranteed a perpetual underclass. Now, contrast that with the biblical release in Deuteronomy 15.
Okay, what does Deuteronomy say?
Not only does the law mandate release in the 7th year, but it includes an explicit command regarding severance.
Severance.
Yes. The text says to the employer, "When you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally from your flock and from your threshing floor and from your wine vat."
Wait, so they are legally required to provide startup capital?
Yes. The employer had to provide enough livestock, grain, and wine for the freed person to restart their independent economic life.
That is incredible.
They were given the resources to ensure they didn't just fall right back into destitution. And the text roots this deeply in Israelite theology.
How so?
It follows that command by saying, Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Because God rescued them and loaded them with the wealth of Egypt when they left, they had a theological obligation to generously restore the people who worked for them.
That is a staggering difference.
Yeah.
But let's look at the worst-case scenario.
Okay.
Let's say a family goes into debt, they sell their labor, they get released in year 7, but the economic conditions in the country are just terrible.
Right, another drought hits.
Yeah. They fall into debt again, and eventually they have to permanently sell off their ancestral farmland. Even with a 7-year labor release, if you don't have land, you have no way to generate generational wealth.
Which is exactly why the biblical law included a secondary, massive systemic reset. The Jubilee.
The Jubilee, detailed in Leviticus 25, right?
Right. The Jubilee occurred every 50th year. It was a total structural reset of the nation's socioeconomic order.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. What actually happens in year 50?
3 massive things happen simultaneously. First, all outstanding debts across the entire nation are canceled.
Wow. Universal debt forgiveness.
Second, any Israelite who was still serving in an indentured contract was immediately released, regardless of how many years they had served.
Okay.
And third, and this is the most radical part, all land that had been sold over the previous 49 years reverted back to the original ancestral family lines.
That is mind-blowing. If you're a wealthy landowner, you can't just buy up all the surrounding farms century after century and create this massive feudal estate.
Exactly. When you bought land in ancient Israel, you weren't actually buying the dirt forever. The text is clear. God says, "The land is mine, you are but aliens and my tenants."
So you couldn't really own it.
No, you are essentially just leasing the agricultural production of that land until the next Jubilee year. The price of the land was calculated based on how many harvests were left until the Jubilee.
Oh, I get it. So if the Jubilee is only 5 years away, the land is cheap.
Right.
If it's 40 years away, it's expensive.
Right. And by forcing the land back to the original families every 50 years, the law structurally prevented the 2 things necessary for a chattel slave system.
Which are?
The permanent concentration of wealth in the hands of a few elite, and the creation of a permanent, landless, exploitable underclass. Generational poverty was essentially outlawed.
Okay, this all sounds incredibly cohesive. But as we dig into the text, there is a glaring exception to the release laws that critics always bring up, and frankly, it sounds barbaric.
The all in the doorpost.
Yes, in Exodus 21, there is a law where an indentured servant goes to his master, and the master literally takes a metal awl and pierces the servant's ear into a wooden doorpost to make him a permanent servant.
Right.
I mean, if the system defaults to freedom, how on earth do you justify pinning a human being to a door?
It is a visceral, jarring image for modern readers, I completely agree. But if we slow down and read the actual conditions of that law in Exodus 21, it actually reinforces the very point we are making about freedom.
How does pinning someone to a door reinforce freedom?
Look at how the law begins. It says, "But if the servant should plainly declare, 'I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free.'"
Wait, the servant initiates it.
Yes. Permanent service was an exception, and it was entirely voluntary. It required an active, public opt-in by the servant.
So the master couldn't force it.
No. The servant had to go before the local judges and make a formal legal declaration that he didn't want to leave. Old Testament scholar John Goldingay notes that these indentured servants often became deeply integrated into the household.
Okay, I can see that.
If your employer was fair and you had married and started a family there, you might genuinely prefer the economic security of that household to starting over from scratch.
And the pierced ear, what's the point of that?
It was a visible, lifelong symbol of a permanent contractual bond. But the structural reality here is what matters. The default state of the biblical law was release and freedom.
Right.
To achieve permanent servitude required the exceptional voluntary intervention of the servant himself.
Which is the exact polar opposite of the system in the antebellum American South.
Completely opposite.
In the American South, the default was absolute, inescapable, inheritable permanence. To get out, to achieve manumission required exceptional, voluntary intervention by the master.
Exactly.
The biblical law defaults to freedom, chattel slavery defaults to bondage.
Precisely. They are diametrically opposed legal structures.
So we've established the exits, we know how people got in, and we know how they got out. But if I'm a critic listening to this, I'm saying, okay, having an exit strategy doesn't excuse cruelty during the contract.
Sure.
Because the brutality of an institution is measured by how it treats the bodies of the people trapped inside it for those 6 years.
So let's talk about bodily autonomy. How did these biblical laws treat these workers?
This is where we encounter what legal scholars identify as the radical protections of the Mosaic Law.
Mm.
There are three specific, unprecedented laws that, if they had been strictly followed, would have made antebellum chattel slavery legally impossible overnight.
Let's take them one by one for everyone listening. What's the first protection? The anti-kidnapping law, found in Exodus 21.16. The text says, "He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death."
Capital punishment for kidnapping.
Yes. In the ancient world, kidnapping people, usually from vulnerable traveling caravans or neighboring tribes, to sell them in slave markets was a massive, lucrative industry.
Right, that was the main supply chain.
Exactly. But the biblical law classified this not as a property crime, but as a capital offense, equating the stealing of a human life with murder.
Think about the implications of that for modern history. The entire transatlantic slave trade was built on kidnapping.
It was.
Every single captive taken from the interior of Africa, marched in chains to the coast, crammed into the hulls of ships, transported across the Atlantic, and sold at auction in Charleston or New Orleans.
Every single one.
Every single one of those people was a victim of a crime that the Bible punished with the death penalty.
And this prohibition extends straight into the New Testament, too. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, the Apostle Paul writes a list of the most severe lawbreakers.
Who does he list?
Right alongside murderers, he lists slave traders. The Greek word literally translates to man-stealers.
Wow.
So the foundational mechanism that supplied the American South with slaves was explicitly condemned by the very book they claimed gave them authority.
Okay, so you can't kidnap people. That cuts off the supply chain. What's the second radical protection?
The anti-harm law. Exodus 21.26-27 deals with physical abuse. It dictates that if a master hits a servant and causes permanent physical injury, the text specifically uses the examples of blinding an eye or knocking out a single tooth, the servant is automatically set free as compensation for the injury.
So if a master loses his temper and punches his worker, knocking out a tooth, the contract is void. The worker just walks away.
Yes. And you have to view this through the lens of economics. The master has paid a significant sum to clear the person's debt in exchange for 6 years of labor.
Right.
If the master physically abuses the servant, he instantly loses the labor he paid for. The law is brilliantly designed. It doesn't just say, be nice. It aligns economic self-interest with physical protection.
It makes physical abuse financially self-defeating.
Exactly.
How does that compare to the surrounding ancient cultures?
Right.
Like, if I'm living in Babylon, what happens if my master knocks my tooth out?
You stay a slave, and perhaps the master pays a fine to the state. Jewish scholar Nahum Sarna makes a definitive statement on this.
What does he say?
He points out that this specific law protecting slaves from maltreatment by legally granting them their freedom is found absolutely nowhere else in the entire existing corpus of ancient Near Eastern legislation. It is a uniquely biblical innovation.
But even if the master doesn't physically strike them, what if the conditions are just unbearable?
Right, emotional abuse or overwork.
Yeah, what if the workload is insane?
Yeah.
If a servant runs away, are we dealing with a Fugitive Slave Act situation where the state hunts them down?
This brings us to the third and perhaps most shocking protection. The Fugitive Slave Protection Law in Deuteronomy 23.15:16.
Okay, what does it say?
The law commands the Israelites, "You shall not hand over to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall live with you in your midst, in the place which he shall choose. You shall not mistreat him."
I really need everyone listening to pause and let that sink in. The law legally forbids returning a runaway.
Yes. Old Testament scholar Tikva Freimer-Kensky argues that this single law effectively turned servitude in Israel into a voluntary institution.
Because they could just leave.
Think about the power dynamic. If you mistreated your servant, they could simply walk away. And when they arrived at the next town, the whole society was legally bound to grant them asylum. They got to choose where they lived.
That is astonishing. And again, the contrast with the rest of the ancient world is just staggering, isn't it?
It's night and day. In Hammurabi's code, if you harbored a runaway slave, the penalty was death.
Death, just for harboring a runaway.
Yes. In the Hittite laws, or the Lipit Ishtar codes, there were massive fines, and runaways were universally hunted down, returned to their owners, and frequently mutilated.
Mutilated how?
They were branded or had a foot cut off to prevent them from running again. The Anchor Bible Dictionary notes that the biblical fugitive laws are the very first appeals in world literature to treat slaves as human beings for their own sake.
When I hear that, my mind immediately jumps to the United States in 1850. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act.
Oh, absolutely.
It legally required citizens in free states in the North to capture runaway slaves and return them to the South, threatening federal prosecution if they refused.
It was a horrific piece of legislation.
And the hypocrisy is just blinding. You had Southern politicians and theologians claiming biblical sanction for their slave system, while actively enforcing a law that violated the Bible's most distinctive, unprecedented labor protection.
It really is wild.
If the American South had actually followed the anti-kidnapping law, the anti-harm law, and the fugitive protection law, their entire plantation economy would have collapsed before it even started.
It is one of the great historical ironies. To defend their institution, they had to systematically ignore the actual text of the Bible.
Okay, we've established that there were incredible safety valves and protections in place. But if I'm a skeptic, I am screaming at my phone right now.
I get that.
Because all of these exits and protections don't erase the fact that there are deeply disturbing texts in this same book. And we promised the listener we wouldn't dodge the hard stuff.
No, we can't.
Having an exit strategy doesn't excuse a law that seemingly lets a master beat someone to death. So let's face these defeater texts head on.
It's essential that we do. We cannot cherry-pick the positive laws and ignore the difficult ones.
The most famous one, the one every critic points to, is Exodus 21.2021. It's the beating law.
Right.
The passage says that if a master beats a male or female servant with a rod, and they don't die immediately but survive for 1 or 2 days, the master is not punished because the servant is his money.
Yes.
I'll be honest, reading that someone is his money just makes my skin crawl. Walk me through how a society, especially one with the protections we just discussed, could possibly justify that phrasing.
I completely understand why that phrasing is repulsive to modern ears. But to understand it, we have to look closely at ancient jurisprudence.
Right.
The critic's reading usually stops at, he is his money, and concludes, the Bible says you can torture people because they are property. But let's look at the first half of that exact same law. If the master strikes the servant with a rod and the servant dies immediately, what does the text say?
It says the master will surely be punished.
Right. But the English translation punished is too weak. The Hebrew verb used there is nakum.
Nakam. What does that mean?
In the context of Old Testament law, nakum refers to lethal vengeance. It means the death penalty.
Wait, if an Israelite master murders his servant, the state executes the master.
Yes. And we cannot overstate how revolutionary that is. In the surrounding ancient cultures, like Babylon, a slave was merely property. If you killed someone else's slave, you paid a fine to compensate for the property damage.
Like breaking someone's cart.
Exactly. But the Mosaic Law fundamentally rejected the property classification for a human life. It treated the master's killing of his own servant as premeditated murder, punishable by death. That elevation of a servant's life was unprecedented.
Okay, that changes the context, but it still leaves the 1 or 2 days caveat. Why does the master avoid the death penalty if the servant lingers before dying?
Because ancient law, much like modern law, was deeply concerned with intent. Think about how our courts work today.
Yeah.
If you intentionally shoot someone and they die, you are charged with first-degree murder. The intent to kill was clear. But if you get into a bar fight, punch someone, and they fall, hit their head, and die 2 days later, you aren't charged with first-degree murder.
You're charged with manslaughter.
Right. The action resulted in death, but death wasn't the intended outcome.
I see. So if the servant dies instantly from a blow with a rod, the court infers that the master swung with murderous intent.
Exactly. But if the servant survives for a day or two, the court infers that the master was administering household discipline, which, we must remember, was a universally accepted cultural norm in the ancient world, applied just as frequently to freeborn children.
That's a good point about the cultural norm.
The law infers that the death was a tragic, unintended consequence of discipline, not premeditated murder. Therefore, the master is not executed.
But the text literally says he isn't punished because he is his money.
Yeah.
That's the part that sounds like they're just treating the human as property.
It sounds like that, but legal scholars point out that this phrase is actually providing the logical basis for the court's inference of intent.
How so?
Because the master has a significant financial stake in the servant's labor, he has a built-in economic disincentive to kill them. The court assumes no rational person would intentionally destroy their own financial investment.
Ah, so it's an assumption about human behavior.
Right. Therefore, the lack of immediate death, combined with the financial disincentive, proves it was manslaughter, not murder.
That makes logical sense, but it's still harsh.
It is harsh, but there is also another fascinating linguistic theory here. Hittite scholar Harry Hofner points out a parallel in Hittite law.
What's the parallel?
He suggests that the Hebrew word translated as money or silver in this specific verse might actually refer to the medical fee paid to a doctor to treat the wounded servant.
Oh, wow.
Under this reading, the master isn't additionally punished by the court because he is already paying for the servant's medical care and losing their labor while they recover.
And we also have to hold this law in tension with the anti-harm law we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
If the master beats the servant, and the servant doesn't die, but loses an eye or a tooth, the servant goes free.
Yes.
So this law isn't a blank check for sadistic torture. It's an ancient legal framework trying to parse out intent and manslaughter within a harsh cultural context.
Exactly. It's mitigating damage in a world that was inherently violent.
Okay, let's move to the next major objection, the issue of foreign servants.
This is a big one.
Leviticus 25 clearly distinguishes between Israelite debtors, who go free in 7 years, and foreigners, whom the text says you can acquire as permanent slaves and pass down to your children.
Right.
Critics point to this and say, there it is. The Bible set up an ethnic caste system. Israelites get rights. Foreigners are permanent chattel.
To dismantle that assumption, we have to look at who these foreigners actually were and how the Israelite economy functioned.
Okay, who are they?
There were two primary groups of non-Israelites entering these contracts: prisoners of war taken in battle, and economic refugees, referred to in Hebrew as the Urger and Toshab, who had fled famine or war in their own lands and sought asylum in Israel.
And the land ownership rules in Israel made it incredibly difficult for refugees.
Completely impossible. Land in Israel was strictly tied to tribal and family ancestry. A foreigner couldn't just walk in and buy a farm. Since they couldn't own land and there was no wage labor market, their only avenue for survival was to attach themselves to an Israelite household through service. And yes, the text allows these to be long-term or permanent contracts, meaning they weren't subject to the automatic 7-year release that applied to Israelite citizens.
But, and this is the critical question for you listening, did the radical protections we talked about apply to them?
Yes, absolutely. There wasn't a separate, brutal legal code for foreigners.
Right.
The anti-harm law applied. If a master knocked out a foreign servant's tooth, they went free. The fugitive slave protection law applied. The mandatory Sabbath rest applied. The law explicitly commands in Leviticus, you shall have the same law for the foreigner and for the native.
So they weren't subjected to chattel cruelty. But were they really stuck forever? Was there any upward mobility?
Yes. The text explicitly outlines scenarios where a foreign servant could save up enough money to redeem themselves and buy their own freedom. That proves they could own personal property and acquire wealth, which is impossible under chattel slavery.
And we actually see these foreigners integrating into the highest levels of Israelite society, don't we?
We do. The book of 1 Chronicles records a genealogy mentioning an Egyptian servant named Jarha.
Jarha.
His Israelite master had no sons, so he gave his daughter in marriage to Jarha, and Jarha inherited the family line. Furthermore, look at Ruth.
Oh, the book of Ruth.
She was a destitute Moabite foreigner who came to Israel, gleaned in the fields, and ended up marrying Boaz, a wealthy Israelite landowner. She became the great-grandmother of King David. This was not a rigid, inescapable ethnic caste system. It was a mechanism for integrating refugees into a tribal economy.
All right, one last difficult text from the Old Testament. Exodus 21. A male servant finishes his 6 years. He gets to go free.
Right.
But the text outlines a scenario. If the master gave him a wife during his service and they had children, the wife and children stay with the master and the man leaves alone.
Yes, this is a tough one.
I read that, and my mind instantly goes to the auction blocks of the American South, where families were ripped apart to be sold for profit. It sounds like forced breeding and family destruction.
It is an agonizing scenario to imagine, but once again, we are reading 19th century economic mechanics into a 13th century BC legal text. In the antebellum South, masters actively broke up families to sell individuals to different plantations for massive financial profit. The individuals were highly unlikely to ever see each other again. That is not what is happening in Exodus 21.
So what is the legal reality here?
It's an issue of overlapping contracts. In the ancient Israelite context, the wife in this scenario was not a piece of property given to the man. She was an indentured servant operating under her own separate contract with the household.
I see.
Yes. Her term of service was independent of his. Let's say she entered service 3 years after he did. When his 7-year release date arrives, he is legally free.
But her contract still has 3 years remaining.
Exactly. The master cannot legally force her to leave and break her contract, and the husband cannot legally demand that the master forfeit the remaining 3 years of labor he paid for.
So it's a temporary separation based on the expiration dates of their respective labor agreements.
Exactly. And crucially, the text and the surrounding laws provide multiple paths for reunion.
Like what?
The husband, who is now free and able to earn his own independent wages, could simply work, save his money, and pay the master to redeem his wife and children from the remainder of their contract.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or he could wait for her contract to expire.
Hmm.
Or if he didn't want to be separated for even a day, he could utilize that permanent servant opt-in we discuss, declaring his love for his family and his master and binding himself to the household.
So it's not a law engineered to destroy families for profit. It's a law navigating the messy reality of two overlapping labor contracts and providing avenues to keep the family intact.
It is an accommodation to economic reality, not a mandate for cruelty.
Okay, so if we zoom out and look at the whole Old Testament system, we see a framework that didn't completely abolish the economic realities of the ancient world, but introduced massive protections, exits, and limitations that consistently pushed toward human dignity.
A redemptive trajectory.
Exactly. But eventually, history moves forward. We arrive at the New Testament. And by the time Jesus and the Apostle Paul show up, we aren't dealing with a small tribal nation practicing indentured servitude anymore. We are dealing with the massive, brutal, empire-wide institution of Roman slavery.
And Roman slavery was vastly different and significantly more brutal than Israelite debt bondage.
Right. And this is where critics often direct their sharpest attacks. They say, okay, maybe the Old Testament was just regulating debt, but the Romans practiced brutal, dehumanizing slavery. If Paul was really speaking for God, why didn't he just write a letter telling all the Christians to pick up swords, revolt, and violently overthrow the system?
It's a fair question, but it shows a deep ignorance of Roman political reality. To understand why Paul didn't call for a violent uprising, we have to look at what happened when people actually tried that.
Spartacus.
Exactly. About a century before Paul was writing, a gladiator named Spartacus led a massive slave rebellion against the Roman Republic. It was a terrifying, bloody conflict.
And how did Rome respond?
When they finally defeated Spartacus, the Roman legions crucified 6,000 surviving slaves along the Appian Way. 6,000 crosses lining the road to Rome, left to rot as a horrifying warning to anyone who would challenge the Roman order.
Wow. So if Paul, who is leading a tiny, marginalized, mostly poor religious sect, had circulated a letter demanding a violent slave revolt,
The Roman Empire would have brought the full, terrifying weight of its military against the early church. They would have annihilated them. And the very first people to be slaughtered, tortured, and crucified would have been the Christian slaves themselves. A violent revolution would have been mass suicide.
so instead of a suicidal frontal assault, the early church utilized what our source material calls the yeast strategy.
The yeast strategies.
And the way I picture this is almost like a computer virus. If you want to take down a massive, heavily fortified mainframe, you don't attack the firewall head-on. You slip a single, tiny line of code into the operating system.
I love that analogy.
Right? It sits there, quietly rewriting the foundational software of the machine, spreading from file to file, until one day, the entire architecture simply cannot function anymore, and the system collapses from within.
That is a phenomenal analogy. The yeast strategy, which references Jesus' parable about the kingdom of heaven working like yeast, slowly transforming a whole batch of dough, was about planting subversive theological lines of code into the Roman operating system.
Let's look at the foundational code they were working with. What was the baseline theological assumption they brought from the Old Testament?
It starts in Genesis 1 with the declaration that all humanity is made in the imago Dei, the image of God. Every human being has inherent divine dignity. We see this beautifully articulated in the book of Job. Job, speaking of his servant, says, "Did not he who made me in the womb make my servant? And did not the same one fashion us in the womb?"
Job is declaring complete ontological equality. The master and the servant are made of the exact same material by the exact same God.
Right. Now, take that theological code and insert it into the Roman legal system. Under Roman law, slaves were classified as res.
Res, what does that mean?
They were literally things. They were property devoid of legal rights. And Roman philosophy backed this up. Aristotle famously argued that some people were natural slaves, that they were intellectually and inherently inferior, designed by nature to be ruled.
So how does Paul rewrite that code?
Look at his letter to the Galatians, chapter 3, verse 28. Paul writes, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus.
He takes an axe to the root of Aristotle's philosophy.
He obliterates it. He declares universal spiritual equality. To a Roman patrician, the idea that a slave was his absolute equal before the creator of the universe was conceptually radioactive.
I bet.
It fundamentally undermined the moral justification for the entire Roman social hierarchy.
And Paul doesn't just stop at philosophy. He gives direct, subversive instructions to the masters. In his letters to the Ephesians and the Colossians, he tells masters to provide their slaves with what is right and fair, and he explicitly reminds the masters that they have the exact same master in heaven, who shows absolutely no favoritism.
Which destroys the legal concept of res. A thing has no right to fair treatment. You don't have to be fair to a plow or a cart.
Exactly.
By demanding that masters treat slaves with justice and fairness, Paul is legally reclassifying them as persons. He places the all-powerful Roman paterfamilias, the male head of the household who had the power of life and death over his slaves, under the exact same divine accountability as the lowest servant.
But the ultimate test case for this strategy is the book of Philemon. Critics love to bring this one up.
Oh, they do.
Paul writes a letter to a Christian slave owner named Philemon. Paul is sending a man named Onesimus back to Philemon's house. The traditional understanding is that Onesimus was a runaway slave. So critics say, look, Paul is acting as a Roman slave catcher. He's enforcing the fugitive slave laws.
It's a superficial reading that entirely misses the explosive nature of what Paul is doing. First, we should note that many modern scholars question whether Onesimus was actually a runaway slave. There is strong evidence he may have been an estranged biological brother of Philemon's seeking Paul's mediation in a family dispute.
Interesting.
But even if we assume the traditional view that he was a runaway slave, we have to look at what Paul actually commands Philemon to do.
She sends Onesimus back, but with a letter that says, what?
Paul commands Philemon to receive Onesimus no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother in the Lord.
No longer as a slave. He explicitly tells him to change the status of the relationship.
Exactly. And here is the genius of the yeast strategy. Paul doesn't just send this as a private, sealed note to Philemon.
He doesn't.
Look at the opening of the letter. It is addressed to Philemon, Apphia, Archippus, and the church that meets in your home. Paul is reading this letter out loud in front of the entire congregation. He is using the peer pressure of the Christian community to force Philemon's hand.
As scholar James Birchall so brilliantly put it in our research, instead of forbidding slavery, impose fellowship.
Impose fellowship. That is the virus in the code. You cannot own your brother. You cannot whip your equal in Christ. You cannot sell a man you take communion with.
Wow.
By demanding Christian fellowship, Paul ensured that the institutional framework of slavery would eventually be dismantled from within. The master-slave dynamic cannot survive true Christian brotherhood.
It's brilliant, subversive, and historically effective. But I want to take a step back and address the massive, lingering philosophical question that I know listeners are chewing on right now.
The big why question.
Yeah, if God is perfectly moral and slavery is inherently evil, why rely on a slow yeast strategy at all? Why tolerate it for centuries? Why didn't God just drop a thunderbolt at Mount Sinai, carve into the stone tablets, "Thou shalt not own another human being," and ban it outright from the dawn of time?
It is the ultimate moral pushback, and it is a deeply understandable question, but it operates on a flawed assumption. It assumes that a divine moral command can simply ignore the actual socioeconomic capacity of the people receiving it.
What do you mean by capacity?
Let's play out the hypothetical. Imagine if God had handed down a thunderbolt command in the 13th century BC. All forms of debt bondage and household labor contracts are hereby permanently abolished. Fast forward 2 years, a massive famine hits the Levant.
Crops fail. People are starving.
Right. And remember, there are no banks, no FEMA, no government grain reserves. In the past, a starving family could offer their labor to a wealthy neighbor to survive. But now, God has legally banned that transaction. The wealthy neighbor says, "I'd love to feed you in exchange for your work, but it's a divine sin to take you in as a servant." What happens to the starving family?
They literally starve to death.
Yes, to demand an immediate, absolute abolition of the only existing social safety net without providing the socioeconomic alternatives like free market capitalism, modern banking, and centralized welfare, which simply did not exist, is to demand a moral framework that ignores the reality of human suffering. It would have killed the very people the critics are trying to protect.
So the law had to meet them where they were.
Exactly. This is what scholar Christopher Wright calls a redemptive movement, hermeneutic. The biblical legislation doesn't always set down a permanent utopian ideal at every single point in history. Instead, it establishes a trajectory.
I think the perfect analogy for this is how Jesus talks about divorce in the Gospel of Matthew. The religious leaders come to Jesus and say, hey, Moses gave us laws permitting divorce. Why?
And Jesus responds, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning.
That is the exact parallel. The Mosaic Law made a concession to the broken, hard reality of human society. It regulated the damage, mitigated the cruelty, and protected the vulnerable as much as the socioeconomic system could handle. But it wasn't the creation ideal.
So the trajectory looks like this. It starts with the absolute ideal in Genesis 1. Every human being has equal divine dignity. Then it moves into the Mosaic Law, which accommodates the brutal economic reality of famine and debt, but introduces unprecedented humane protections that undermine the concept of property.
And then into the New Testament.
Right, where Paul declares universal spiritual equality and injects the virus of Christian fellowship, and finally it moves out into church history toward total abolition.
Yes. And we have to remember that all lasting modern moral progress operates via structural transformation, not bare prohibition. Think about civil rights or women's suffrage. You don't just pass one law and instantly fix the darkness in human nature. You have to change the structural conditions, the economic realities, and most importantly, the moral imagination of a society over generations.
And the Bible provided the moral imagination that made abolition conceivable.
Which brings us to our final and arguably most important question of this deep dive. Did this redemptive trajectory actually work?
Did the yeast do its job?
Exactly. If we zoom out from ancient Israel, zoom out from the Roman Empire, and look at the vast timeline of global human history, what was the actual fruit of this biblical framework?
The fruit is a stunning, undeniable historical fact, one that is powerfully highlighted by the economist Thomas Sowell.
What does Sowell point out?
He points out a reality that makes modern people very uncomfortable. Slavery has been the universal norm in virtually every major civilization in human history. The Egyptians built their empire on it. The Mesopotamians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese dynasties, the Aztecs, the Islamic empires, the African kingdoms, they all practiced pervasive, brutal slavery.
It wasn't an anomaly, it was the baseline operating system of humanity.
Exactly. But here is Sowell's pivotal observation. The abolition of slavery as a widespread moral movement happened exactly once in all of human history, and it occurred in the Christianized West, driven by explicitly Christian theological commitments.
That is incredible. And I know critics love to say, well, sure, abolition happened in the West, but it was driven by secular Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century, not the Bible.
And historical data proves that argument completely false.
Yeah.
There is not a sudden secular awakening in the 1700s. There is a continuous 14th century arc of fierce Christian opposition to slavery that builds momentum over time. We can trace the yeast working its way through the dough century by century.
Take us through that timeline. Where do we see the first major crack in the concrete?
Go back to the 4th century. A prominent church father named Gregory of Nyssa, living in what is now Turkey, delivers a fiery sermon, his 4th homily on Ecclesiastes. He doesn't just ask for better treatment of slaves. He explicitly attacks the entire foundational concept of slavery based on Genesis 1.
What was his argument?
He argues logically. If God made man the master of the earth, and God gave man dominion over the animals, how dare a man claim dominion over another man?
That's a powerful argument.
He asks the congregation, what price did you put on reason? How many obols did you pay for the image of God? He concluded that it was an arrogant usurpation of God's authority to own a human being. The historian Kyle Harper notes that Gregory's denunciation of the institution is without parallel in the ancient world. No Greek or Roman philosopher was saying this.
Wow. And what happens as we move forward in history?
In the 5th century, you have St. Patrick. Patrick actually kidnapped by pirates as a teenager and sold into slavery in Ireland. When he escapes, becomes a priest, and returns to Ireland, he writes a furious, passionate letter excommunicating warlords who were raiding coasts and enslaving Christians. He is one of the first recorded abolitionists. And moving into the medieval period. You see monastic orders dedicating vast sums of wealth to physically redeeming slaves from markets. You see Catholic canon law making it increasingly difficult and eventually illegal to trade in Christian human beings. The system of ancient slavery morphed into serfdom, which, while deeply flawed, recognized the legal personhood and family rights of the workers.
But then the colonial era hits, the New World is discovered, and the transatlantic slave trade begins.
And immediately the church pushes back. When the Spanish and Portuguese begin enslaving the indigenous populations of the Americas, the papacy issues severe decrees.
Like what?
In 1435, Pope Eugene IV issues the bull Secret Dudum, demanding the freedom of enslaved natives in the Canary Islands on pain of excommunication. In 1537, Pope Paul III issues Sublimis Deus, explicitly declaring that the indigenous peoples are true men who cannot be deprived of their liberty or property, even if they aren't Christians.
And as we hit the 18th and 19th centuries, that theological yeast finally ferments into an unstoppable political movement. You have William Wilberforce, an evangelical Christian, spending 20 grueling years in the British Parliament fighting to outlaw the slave trade. His entire argument, his entire worldview, was grounded in the biblical anthropology we've been discussing.
And in America, you have the Quakers, who started protesting slavery as early as the 1680s because they believed the inner light of Christ was in every human being. The Underground Railroad, which funneled escaping slaves to the north, was operated heavily by Christians and pastors. And what law did they cite to justify breaking the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850?
They cited Deuteronomy 23, the ancient law that said you shall not return a runaway slave.
Exactly. The ancient code was their direct moral justification for modern civil disobedience.
But I have to play devil's advocate here, because this is the heaviest weapon the critics have.
Sure.
It is an undeniable historical fact that the slaveholders in the American South also used the Bible. They read from the same book. They preached sermons defending slavery, citing the curse of Ham and Paul's commands for slaves to obey their masters. Doesn't the fact that the text was used to justify such profound evil prove that the text is, at best, complicit and at first, inherently corrupt?
It is a tragic, horrific reality that the Bible was weaponized that way. But it doesn't prove the text is complicit. It proves that human beings have an infinite capacity to twist a text to justify their own economic greed. The hypocrisy objection actually confirms the biblical position.
Walk me through that logic. How does their hypocrisy confirm the Bible?
Think about what the slaveholders had to do to maintain their theological defense. They couldn't just read the whole Bible. They had to selectively, violently excise the parts they didn't like.
Ah, I see.
They had to ignore the anti-kidnapping laws that made their slave ships illegal. They had to ignore the anti-harm laws that made their whips illegal. They had to ignore the fugitive protections that made their bloodhounds illegal. And they had to ignore Paul's declaration in Galatians that slaves and free men are entirely equal. They weren't applying the Bible, they were systematically violating it to protect their wealth.
Our source material brings in the voice of Frederick Douglass here, and honestly, his perspective is the ultimate mic drop on this entire debate.
It really is.
Douglass was born into slavery. He was beaten, he was starved, he suffered unimaginable cruelty under the hands of men who called themselves Christian slaveholders. If anyone had the right to look at the Bible and declare it a tool of oppression, it was Frederick Douglass. But in his autobiography, he makes a razor-sharp, devastating distinction.
Yes. Douglass writes about the profound difference between what he called the Christianity of Christ and the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land.
He saw right through the counterfeit. He recognized that the religion of his masters was a grotesque manipulation. The very man whose personal suffering modern critics try to invoke to condemn the Bible recognized that the true, uncorrupted biblical text was actually his greatest resource for liberation.
And that completely flips the modern critical narrative on its head. When you actually look at the historical, linguistic, and legal realities, the paradigm shifts entirely. The Bible was not the slaveholders' tool that the courageous abolitionists had to somehow overcome. The Bible was the abolitionists' conceptual engine. It was the driving force that the slaveholders tried, desperately and ultimately in vain, to suppress.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We started by trying to map a coastline that seemed murky and impenetrable. We've navigated the translation trap, exposing how the ancient Hebrew concept of a dignified ebed was tragically misunderstood by modern eyes.
And we explored the harsh realities of the ancient Near Eastern subsistence economy and how the Israelite system provided a voluntary safety net with mandatory exits like the 7-year release and the Jubilee.
We uncovered the radical, unprecedented legal protections, anti-kidnapping, anti-harm, and fugitive sanctuary that made permanent chattel slavery structurally impossible in ancient Israel.
We didn't shy away from the hard texts, discovering that laws that seemed to permit cruelty were actually sophisticated ancient jurisprudence designed to mitigate abuse, punishing the murder of a servant with the death penalty.
We trace the New Testament's subversive yeast strategy, watching the early church dismantle the Roman concept of human property by imposing radical Christian brotherhood.
And finally, we tracked that redemptive trajectory across 14 centuries, witnessing how the theological conviction that every human bears the image of God became the ultimate catalyst for the global abolition movement.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. Something to wrestle with as you go about your day. When we look back across the vast chasm of history and encounter ancient texts, how should we judge them? Do we demand that a Bronze Age document perfectly mirror our 21st century sensibilities, completely ignoring the brutal economic realities those ancient people were trying to survive?
That is the path of historical arrogance.
Right. Or do we judge an ancient text by examining the trajectory it set in motion? Think about the computer virus analogy. If a text written in the harsh, unforgiving world of the ancient Near East manages to inject a specific line of code into the human operating system, the radical idea that every single person bears the divine image, and that code slowly, inexorably spreads until it destroys the ancient world's most ubiquitous and oppressive institution.
And it changes everything.
Exactly. Maybe that text isn't a relic of oppression. Maybe that text is far more revolutionary, far more subversive, and far more redemptive than we ever realized. Keep reading, keep questioning, and keep digging deep.